Hello, my name is John Cornicello, and I welcome you to my series of live interactive photo conversations. You can check out the schedule at cornicello.com/conversations for dates and times of upcoming shows. My guest today is Calvin Grier. Calvin is a carbon printer, which I know very little about. So let's get started with his presentation about excelling at failure. Please welcome Calvin Grier.
Thanks for having me. I wanted to say thanks to Stephen Shore. I got an email from him a couple of weeks ago. I don't know, are you connected, Stephen?
Yeah, he's there.
Yes, I'm on.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks for putting this me in contact with John and kind of making this happen. So let's start off by just talking a little bit about the carbon process, because as John said, it's not a process that a lot of people are familiar with. I don't know how many people here, kind of a raise of hands, have actually seen a color carbon print in person. So we got 2, 3, so 4, 5, 6. So we got 6 or 7 people. So I just want to go through a quick run of what goes into making a print, and then we can talk about, I can show you some prints, answer some questions, and I kind of wanted to get into failure and what goes into spending a couple of years just failing a print after print after print until you actually make something that you're kind of happy with. So without further ado, this evening I've been making emulsions in the back of my studio. So I'm going to flip the camera around here. So in this room, I've got a bunch of emulsions, and I've got my dim lighting because those are sensitive to light. And I'm just going to close the door here so I can turn on normal lighting. And so these emulsions are just a combination of gelatin. So let's flip this around again. So we've got gelatin, just like you would eat. And we're going to mix that with sugar and something that's going to make it sensitive to light. So I'm using DOS. And then I'm going to mix that also with the pigment. So here I have some green earth, and I've got some red earth. I'm working on some earth tone pigments, or you can use synthetic pigments. So we've got tolucyanine, blue, benzamina azulone yellow, quinacridone magenta. So the common CMYK colors that you already see, and also have black pigment for my black channel. So I'm going to mix all those together, pour them on a sheet, and that gives me my photographic emulsion. So very simple. We're going to take that emulsion and switch over to dim lighting again. And I have a number of emulsions here. So here, let's grab some that earth tones, some that I can turn the light on and not doing anything. Let's grab. So here's kind of a failed one from last year. So here we have, flip this around. So here we have a really crappy emulsion. So this one is earth pigments. I'm actually going to grab maybe one that's a little bit, you can see a little bit more what's going on. So January, let's see, neutral black. I'll just grab a little tiny thing here. So this is our photographic emulsion. And all we need to do is expose this to ultraviolet light. And so we have our exposure units over here. And I have a vacuum table, which I have some prints on that I'll show you in a minute. And we're going to expose this with a negative. So all I'm going to do is take a negative like this one up here. And so this is a photo of a tree. I will put that in contact with that piece of emulsion. And then I will expose through the negative with UV light onto that emulsion. And where the light can pass through this negative, those clear spots, it's going to harden the gelatin, make it insoluble in water, in hot water. And the rest of it is going to melt away in hot water. So I'll take this now into the back part of the studio.
So do you make your negatives on a inkjet printer, or are you shooting large format, or doing internets?
I absolutely hate inkjet printers. I use right now I'm working on an image setter, which is kind of old technology. So I'm printing on silver-based, old litho film, basically, that's exposed with a laser.
Sure, I used to run a type bureau and we used image setters.
Yeah. So that's they're kind of died out or dying out. So I'll be switching over probably pretty soon to the new Kodak has a thermal film called DITR. It has a few drawbacks, but the resolution is just absolutely insane. You could basically print a portrait down to the cellular level if you wanted to. So it kind of blows inkjets out of the water. I mean, image setter blows anything, really blows inkjet prints out of the water. It's not really a high bar to pass. So anyways, I'm going to take my emulsion here, and I'll get some water going. So some water here, like so. I'm going to soak my little piece of emulsion in water, take it over to a table. I'm just going to squeegee off the excess water, and then I'll transfer this to either a sheet of plastic, which we'd call a temporary support, or I could print this directly onto a sheet of paper. So I've got usually I print onto watercolor paper, so I could print directly onto this. So all I have to do is transfer with a roller this emulsion face down onto either my temporary support or onto the paper. But let's look at how we do this on the plastic. So I put these together, and then I'm going to bring those over, and I put it into hot water now. I can peel off the emulsion, which is going to leave an image on this plastic temporary support. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the whole thing. But so imagine that we have now this image on our plastic temporary support. I'm then going to take that and I'm going to transfer it over to a sheet of paper that has a lot of gelatin on it. So we'll have something like this, where we'll take the plastic and transfer it to a sheet of gelatin sub paper underwater. All of this happens underwater, hang it up to dry, and then once it's dry, I can peel this off. And my image is now going to be on that paper. And so now we've looked at, if we were to transfer this directly to the paper the first time, that would be called a single transfer print. If we transfer it to the plastic, then the paper, we call that a double transfer print. And so what happens when you do a double transfer is this relief of this gelatin gets kind of glued into the double transfer, the gelatin on the double transfer prints, so they tend to be kind of flat. So if you want that relief back and print on matte paper, I can then take this paper, I can flip that and transfer it to another piece of paper. And we call that a triple transfer. And I do that the same. I put it underwater and then mate them together, put it in hot water, and I can peel them apart. So very quick overview of the process. If you follow that, then congratulations. So here I've got a little mind map. So let's flip this around again. So here's kind of the process of creating a negative, registering that, exposing it, mating, developing, kind of hardening between layers. You do second transfer and third. So this is kind of the process. I wrote a book earlier this year on just on calibration. So I wrote a 300-page book that just covers this little bit. So imagine that this is just 300 pages. This is what you need to know to be able to make a carbon print. so you can see where all of this is just trial and error, basically trying to figure out, okay, what works, what doesn't work. And so that accounts for just thousands and thousands of hours of failed prints. And that's what I want to get to later. So let's look at some prints. So the first print I made, well, basically,
is that chart available somewhere for people to download or look at?
It's on my Instagram
Okay.
and my Facebook. But if people want a high resolution one, send me an email and I'll send it out. So when I started out, doing the simple single transfer, working with dichromate, which is kind of what would traditionally be used, and working with inkjet negatives, which was kind of what I had at hand. And so I just actually last week, I went through the studio and just cleaned everything because I spent about 4 months working on gum printing, and everything was just a disaster. And so I just went through and organized everything, and I threw out probably about, I don't know, 2/3 of my failed prints at the beginning. So we just have a little bit here. But when I started out, just making a bunch of little test charts, things that don't work, prints that the calibration is just really weird, things like that. So I didn't start off just all of a sudden making really nice prints. You have to work on it. So the first time I made a good print was after about 2 months of research, which was this one. So this is what I call my first print. So I started in September 2015. I made this one in November. So then after a few months, I switched over, still using inkjet negatives, but I started using more than one. I started using one for the highlights, another one for the midtones, and then for the shadows. So I get a little bit more tonal separation. Whereas this one, you see the highlights are kind of blown out here. Or here you get a little bit more tonality, and here a little bit more still. But it's not a good print by any means. The transition here is just absolutely horrible. And so it wasn't until I switched from inkjet negatives, which you asked about earlier, which is what this print was made with, inkjet, over to image setter. And if you can see it in person, you'll see how much more detail there is in the image setter one. Much easier to calibrate, and yeah, just much easier to work with on all levels and much higher quality. So then I could print, tonalities and the highlights that surpass pretty much anything out there. So things like this.
What image setter are you using?
Agfa Vantra 44S.
Uh-huh.
And I actually don't own an image setter.
Yeah.
Image setters, I mean, they've got to be used continuously.
Mhm.
So unless you are outputting a lot of film, it's just not financially viable. So I have a service about 15 minutes away from me that makes my negatives for me.
Nice.
But some people wonder, am I going to, I'll be able to print in 5 years or whatever with image setter negatives? Yes, it's not going away. The flexo industry depends on a photoresist. So whether those are made on old litho film or on the newer Kodak film, it's going to be around for a long time. So there's no worry about that. So then I started printing in color. So let's flip this around again. So here are a few color prints. So you kind of get an idea of what these, some of them, I've got this one in glossy, but that just looks awful. So I've got another one in matte, things like that. And then I've got kind of more, actually, this is a piece by Michael Strickland, photograph. And this was my first color print. So this is the first time I, tried making in color. And because I kind of had everything controlled in black and white, it turned out all right, but there's still quite a bit to learn. Here are actually some photos from just 8x10, so straight from analog negative. And these are interesting because they're multi-layer. So I've exposed for a layer for my midtones or my highlights, and another one for my midtones and one for the shadows as well. So I've got 3 different layers that I've put together to make those prints. But then I get to do interesting things like this. So going beyond just CMYK. So this print took about a month and a half to create, where this actually has a extra amber layer. So I've got an amber pigment in this one. And then also I spent a couple weeks researching a kind of greenish yellow. So there's actually 2 different yellows, and I used about 4 different negatives on that just for the yellows. So image setter negatives, the dot size, it'd be the equivalent of using an inkjet printer with 14 different yellows, with different shades of yellow. So I'm pretty sure this is the printer in the world with the most subtleties in the yellows, I think. So here's a print of my wife. You see a lot of prints of her. That's actually not a carbon print, gum print, which I'll talk about a little bit about later too. And then other cool thing about carbon prints is the depth. So see if you can kind of see this.
Yes.
That it's got a little bit of dimension to it.
Little
And it depends.
bay relief.
Yeah. So if you print on photographic papers, you can get a lot of relief. I usually print on watercolor paper, so I don't get a lot. And I can control that. I can control, how much relief I get, if I want it really matte or if I want it kind of glossy. I usually like this little bit of relief that comes with it. But then I'm going to show you my absolute favorite print. So this one up here is a photograph by Louise Dahl Wolf. And this was actually printed with just earth pigments. So ground up rock, dirt, basically. So making a full color print out of, we have red ochre from Midelt in Morocco. We have the blue is lapis lazuli. I've got green earth from France, yellow ochre from France as well, and then the black is just carbon. So I have this print next to my exposure unit, not worrying that this is going to fail or fade, because it's it's not going to fade. It's made out of rocks. So so there's a couple people making prints still. Like I said, Todd Gangler in Seattle. If you want to go check out his studio, since you're in Seattle. John Bladen Bentley in Toronto. You have Charles Berger in LA. But Charles is retired. Todd is, I think, about to. I don't know if John still makes prints or if he just prints for himself. Gerard Anier in France. I really don't know if he's making prints anymore either. So as far as I know, making a living off of carbon printing, I think I'm the only person. So it's a small group. So any questions about the process or that before I jump into talking about failure?
Yeah, I don't see many questions over in the chat, but if someone wants to unmute and ask a question, please jump in.
Yeah, you brought about, you mentioned the aspect of making money doing it. So I'm curious, what is your business model? Are you printing for other people or shooting your own works or selling them or what?
Yeah, so I've kind of had to diversify a little bit since COVID. And I started diversifying a little bit before COVID too, fortunately. So I wasn't depending on prints. When I started out, my business plan was, okay, I'm gonna print for other people and that's it. But then you start finding other ways to make money and you follow this path. So probably the most profitable part of my business is workshops. So I have people coming from, and everybody comes to my studio. So these are, people from South America, from Europe. I ran out of space, so they're just, small pins now. But I've got from pretty much all over the world. I've taught.
Hey, you forgot my country on the map.
Well, you haven't come yet. So when you're here, you get to put a pin on the map. So I'm really fortunate that there's interest in this process, and so I've been able to give workshops to about 60 people from about 28 countries. And last year was completely booked, and part of this year too. But COVID kind of, that all just fell apart. It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat from Anne Marie asking if you're planning again in Europe when restrictions lift.
Yeah, so I'm actually starting out in a week and a half, giving workshops again for people coming from Europe, because there's no travel. I mean, there's fewer travel restrictions with the right paperwork and getting a negative PCR test. You can travel.
Yeah, for those who joined in late and don't know, you're in Valencia, Spain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your,
So I'll
your
be giving a
accent doesn't
workshop.
give that away.
No, no. So giving a workshop for 2 people in April. And then I've got another one in May for the whole month for a Spanish couple. And then in June for people who come from the States. So hopefully they've kind of lifted up or have the COVID, you know, the vaccine passport or something by that time.
How long do these workshops last?
10 days.
Okay.
And I used to do 5-day workshops, but it's just, if you remember seeing that mind map, it's just too much to fit in 5 days. So I find 10 days is much, much better. So that's one part, giving workshops. The other part is book sales. So because of COVID last year, I couldn't do workshops. So I just sat down and started writing a book on calibration and started out working about 10 hours a day and then started doing 12 hours and 14. And I was doing 16-hour days writing. Towards the end of, it took me 42 days to write a 300-page book with all illustrations and publish it myself and learn InDesign and layout all that. So a lot of, 60-hour days at the end there.
Yeah.
But I think people have really liked it. I've sold quite a few copies, so I'm making, money off of that. I sell pigments. So I was kind of telling before we connected, John, that part of the problem with printing is you don't have access to good materials, or they don't make these materials anymore. So you have to find people who make them. Usually they are manufacturers that work at an industrial scale. So if you buy pigments, you have to buy maybe 100 kilos of pigments, so a couple hundred pounds, which can cost 10,000 euros. So I end up just reselling those pigments because it's something that most people wouldn't be able to do. And then just earlier this week, Mario, which I was talking to earlier, wanted some clips. And so I have like the world's best clip, which they only make here in Spain, apparently. So I found the Spanish manufacturer that makes these clips because they just work really well, because we're hanging up sheets with gelatin. They might have a 1.5 liters of gelatin. So there, you got 4 pounds of gelatin on the sheet. So you need a clip that really holds on well. So I bought minimum orders like 3,000 clips. So I guess I'll resell those or something later. So
do you have online workshops for carbon printing?
Not really. I've done some consulting and stuff, but
yeah.
I like working with people in person.
And someone else was asking, are the pigments you use watercolor?
No, I tried. So I've got boxes and boxes of pigments. I'll probably spend, I don't know, 1,000 hours on testing different pigments. And so I've got just boxes and boxes of just pigments. So industrial watercolors, and that's not including, I've got more boxes of watercolors up there and stuff. So just, I've got a photo that I put on my Instagram. It's kind of funny. I just laid everything out. Hit my phone. So sorry about that. So no, I use industrial. It's an industrial dispersion. So what would be used for making the inks? So like Epson would contact one of these manufacturers and say, okay, I need a pigment to use in my inks for my printer, and they'll send them a dispersion. Then they'll add that to whatever they're dispersing in for their printer, whether it be glycol or whatever. Or maybe you're making acrylic paints. The acrylic paint manufacturer will contact them and get this dispersion and then mix it with acrylic medium, and that's how they'll make the paint. So because we're just mixing that with gelatin, and that's how we make our emulsions. So just going straight to the source.
I don't want to.
There's a comment from Amy about possibly using ceramic supply places for pigments, but she doesn't know if it'll be suitable.
Yeah, possibly. A lot of powder pigments.
Buenas, te traigo 3 cajas. Paquetes.
¿Para quién?
Para ti. Calvin, ¿no?
Sí.
Te traigo.
I've got some packages coming. It's probably the clips.
Yeah.
It's like I've got 3 big packages, so we'll see what these are. But yeah, some powder pigments work, but they're not going to be as fine as the industrial ones.
Yeah, I don't see. So Stephen Johnson's asking, can agar be used instead of gelatin?
Can what?
Stephen, you wanted to ask the question? You're muted.
Yeah, I was wondering, instead of gelatin, if agar can be used, because it's used for some other gelatin substitutes.
I haven't tried it. I know there are some substitutes that people have tried, but no, I haven't tried. It might work better for gum printing or for direct carbon instead of transferring it, because I don't know if it'd be sticky enough to make that transfer. So
Okay, thank you.
Ian, did you
Yeah.
have a question?
Yeah, I don't want to belabor the business side of things, but I'm just curious. How do you market yourself? How do people find out about you for your workshops or?
yeah,
pigments
so
or whatever?
social media is great. It's made this really easy to be able to find people and for people to find me. Word of mouth too. I'll work with one person and they'll tell their friends about the workshop and so and Google a little bit, but mostly through social media. The packager.
Yeah, yeah. We're live.
Yeah.
We get interruptions.
So as soon as he drops those off, then we'll jump into failure. So
Great. While we're waiting for the deliveries, anyone else have some questions you want to ask right now?
Newland,
Yes, Michael Newler.
I've got a couple of questions. You said before
Sure.
that you make a living. Do you make a
Yeah.
profit?
yeah, I do actually make a profit.
And what's the average size of one of the prints?
Probably my most common size that people order is 11 by 14 inches. And I get a few 16 by 20s, but if you look at my prices, the smaller prints like an 8 by 10 or something, I don't even include those. So I'll show- so these are all clips. So we've got 3,000 clips. So if you want some clips, let me know.
I definitely reserve some.
Estoy haciendo una conferencia con está 100 personas viendo aquí. Sí, 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 sí. Sorry about this.
How long-
Okay.
and how long does it take you to make, let's say, a 60 by 20?
Yeah, so it takes me about 5 days. So I'm usually making triple transfers. I can make a single transfer print in half an hour. But because I'm making triple transfer prints, multiple layers usually, it takes me about 5 days. During those 5 days, it's about 20 man hours of work, depending on how complicated the print is. If a print has 6 layers plus gloss and 7 layers, and there's maybe 14 different negatives, or if it's just a simple black and white print. So it really depends. And if I have to do research to work through pigments to get a palette for a certain certain style that somebody's going for, it might take me a month and a half of research to make a single print. So it's definitely a slow process.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's a few more questions
There's
coming in.
satellite somewhere else.
Yep.
What is the benefit of the triple transfer?
Yeah, so here I have actually, I don't have the triple with me. Because at home, I've got a lot of prints at home. But a double transfer print is going to have kind of a semi-gloss surface to it. And it's just kind of, you don't have that kind of relief. It's a little bit. Gracias, adios. Whereas a triple transfer like this one, you do get that relief back there. So you get kind of a gloss differential there, which is actually kind of nice in the carbon print. And it also lets you print on matte paper, which a double transfer usually has to be on more of a luster paper. So it has that benefit as well.
And how do you ship these prints? And what type of paper are you using?
I'm usually printing on 300 pound paper, 600 gram. A lot of times I'm printing on Fabriano, and so you can't fold that. So I ship them flat.
How? What transporter?
So this is kind of funny. So with the clips, you left the cart.
Uh-oh.
So give me a second. I'm gonna.
I'm sure he will be back.
Yeah, I'll be doing a bit of editing on this this broadcast.
We'll just edit out these 3 minutes here.
So how many of you guys do carbon printing? Whoa. And so how important is the relief? Because I'm a still photography student at the Glassell School of Art in Houston. I visited the Museum of Fine Art Houston's study room and pulled out, seen the 1940s carbon print, and I don't see any relief on it. So no one answered me that. So the relief is just aesthetic, or it's something must.
I don't know, does someone that does printing want to jump in there? I don't have an answer for that.
Don't do carbon printing, but that's certainly one of the charms of seeing the carbon prints over the years is that relief, because that dimensionality that gets added is part of the magic, I think.
So I'm back.
Okay, so a couple of questions came in.
Yeah, so
Let's
that
see.
whole interruption was for these
Yeah,
clips. So with one of these, I can hold up a whole sheet. So they're nice and strong and work really well. So
very cool. Let
was-
me step back a little bit. Let's see. David was curious, given your bins and bins of pigment testing, are there any rare or fascinating pigment ingredients that you covet or would like to try but are financially impractical to obtain, like a sizable amount of Croatian scarlet?
yeah, so usually
We lost
pigments, the one-
lost your voice for a second.
can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I was just. So yeah, so the only one that's really kind of rare is maybe the lapis lazuli, which gets kind of expensive. And so I give people an option whether they want to use the synthetic version or the natural version. And so that would change. I'm not using because a lot of them tend to be not necessarily light fast, or they tend to be toxic, and they also have to work with the process. So there's a lot of things going on there.
So what does an 1114 print cost to have made by you?
11 by 14, I don't even know. So production costs, it's like 40 by 50. So for black and white, about 500, and a color about 1,000.
Uh-huh. Do you ever use Hahnemühle papers?
Yeah, I don't really like them that much for carbon printing. They don't have a really heavy internal size. So I tend to use more Arches and Fabriano.
And how does the color profile of a carbon print compare to that of a dye transfer?
Dye transfer is going to be larger. There's nothing that's going to really compete with the gamut of a dye transfer print. But the problem with the dye transfer print is it's going to fade. It's dyes. So,
and the matrices aren't made anymore.
There's still people making dye transfer, and you can.
Huh.
I mean, I'm making basically the difference is I'm making my matrix with the pigment in the matrix, and that becomes the print. Whereas dye transfer, the matrix, you soak it in dye, and that's what's transferred over. So you can make your own matrix if you want. But I mean, they're stable if you keep them in the dark, but if they're exposed to light, they're going to fade. Whereas a carbon print isn't going to fade. So. And I've found too that the gamut, like 99% of what I'm printing, I've actually backed off on a lot of my densities because it's just not necessary. Pretty much all of prints, or the landscapes, portraits, you just don't need that much density. You don't need that much gamut. And I'm actually working more with earth pigments now, which have a very, very small gamut, just because they're just so beautiful. For those who didn't see the print, so this one. I mean, the gamut on this is just minuscule. It's just really, really small. So.
Yeah, it has a quality of an old time sort of an autochrome.
Yeah.
Let's
so
see.
do you want to jump into talking about failure?
Sure.
And then come back to.
I mean, that's the title of our talk today: excelling at failure.
Yeah.
Could we also, before we go there, could we ask about permanence? Do you do any evaluation of how stable these pigments are over time?
Yeah, so I stick them. I've got a very sophisticated way of doing this. I just stick them out in the Spanish sun for a year and see what happens. And you can also see ratings online for pigments. Manufacturers usually come with a rating, so you can have an idea of how long those are going to last. So,
what's the difference between that and inkjet printing? Epson.
It's going to be longer. Our carbon print's going to last longer in most circumstances if you use the right pigments. Like all my pigments have a blue wall scale rating of 8. So they're going to last about 900 megalux hours, whereas most inkjet prints last, between 100, 200. So in general, they're going to last longer. But if you look at like the earth pigments, I mean, those are never going to fade. So you're going to have them for like 1 billion years. And it's not going to fade. So it really depends on what pigments you're using.
Before we switch over, though, do you do any telephone consulting or Q&As?
Yeah, not really. If
Okay.
people are signed up for workshops, I do a lot of Skyping with people and talking, but it's usually for people who've taken the workshop or are signed up. And I usually don't, I'm not making any money off of that. It's just kind of helping people through that process.
John, I did have one more question, if it's okay.
Yeah.
You're calling them carbon printing because the black is carbon. Is that correct? There's nothing
Yeah.
else that's carbon.
Yeah. Some people call them pigment prints, but a lot of pigment prints, that's what they call inkjet prints now. And sometimes they'll call inkjet prints made with carbon pigment carbon prints. So it's like, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to jump over to my computer here and let's unmute this. Mute this, turn this on. And so can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So now I'm on my, I'll just put that down. So let me open up my failure. So last night, so I wrote this kind of cheat sheet, which I just opened, of kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit earlier this week. And then last night, I decided, okay, maybe I should do a little bit of research into this. So I watched some TED Talks and kind of see, what they're talking about failure, because it's kind of a popular topic now. And so a lot of the themes seem to be, okay, we're talking about fear of failure and that kind of being a hindrance to creativity, or how failure creates resilience or innovation, or you have the fail fast philosophy, or even kind of going against that. But I didn't see anything about really how to mentally deal with a print that just doesn't work. So even after, I mean, we're talking about prints that at the beginning when I started printing, whole prints that just wash off the page. Or recently I had a print last year. The print actually took me a whole year to make because I was having problems with this. I don't know if I have some of the failures, but it's kind of a sealing with, it was just solid pigment of the iron oxide. It was giving me problems and I couldn't figure out why, and finally figured out 3 solutions to that, or 3 parts that figured out the solution. But it was just failing with this print. And, it gets really frustrating. How do you deal with that of just things not working out? So to talk about failure, you kind of have to talk about success. So I'm a climber. I was talking to John about Seattle and climbing a little bit, but in climbing, it's kind of easy to define success, because if you get from the bottom of the route to the top of the route, well, you've succeeded. But it's subjective too. So maybe you only get a third the way up the route and you fall off, but if you had fun, well, that's, you're successful. Or I'm also a musician. That's what my original training is in music. I was planning on being an orchestral tuba player. And then about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, decided that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a carbon printer. And so I left that, but you can play through a piece perfectly, technically perfect piece, but it can be boring as hell. And it's not going to be interesting. Nobody's going to pay any attention to it. You don't evoke an emotion. So it's like Ansel Adams said once too. The negative is the composer's score, and the print is the performance. And that's kind of what I'm dealing with too, where sure, I can get a good photo from somebody, but if I don't interpret that photo correctly, if I add too much gloss to one part of it, or maybe it's a black and white and it comes out too cool, or whatever, the print can be absolutely perfect technically, but just not work with that photo. So we call that, a failure. And then we kind of have small scale versus large scale failures. So imagine you're a musician and you play through a piece for an audition. And from that audition, you have a successful audition, and then you get a part in a regional orchestra. And then from there, you maybe go over to a larger one that maybe land one of the big gigs in the US or something. And from, we'd say that would be kind of a larger scale success. And same in photography, maybe you take a perfect photograph, but until you maybe make a career out of that, that would be, a successful career. But this is all, everything I'm going to say is kind of through my lens with my goals in mind. So don't think that this is the only way to do this, or, the right way or whatever. My failed attempt might be a success of somebody else. So a lot of times in carbon, you'll get this on the edge where it frills. It kind of detaches from the side or even within a print. And I had a client come and she was just really, really proud of this print she made because it had frilled, because it kind of made this kind of weird edge on the side. So she's really happy with this, where it would have been my failure, but in her case, she was really happy with it and a success. So I want to kind of focus on those small scale immediate failures. So we're talking about print detaching in places, frilling, bubbles, where you get bubbles all over a print, or kind of looks like somebody might have acne. Incorrect colors, banding, lots of grain. We get this thing where the dots can get too tall and fall over, and it makes a really ugly grainy print. Other unwanted textures, we get pigment staining, so you might have this absolutely horrible color cast to a print, blowing out highlights, pole marks, any of other. You remember that mind map? You have 100 other things that can go around with the print. So that's kind of what we're dealing with as carbon printers. So we want to see these failures through rose-colored glasses, kind of see the positive view of these failures. So I've kind of set up success and failure as opposites, but that doesn't really have to be the case. So I think it's maybe a little bit of a cliche, but learn from your failures. And you can, so when you start off printing, I say learn from your failures, but it's more than that. So when you start printing, the failures you're going to have are quite large, and you have a problem and you don't know how to fix it. So you try 30, 40 different things, and out of those 30, 40 different things, you find one thing that works. But as you go on, let's say that you're trying to fix that problem of frilling. So to fix that, you change the amount of sensitizer, and you find out, okay, that has no effect on the frilling. But you run into later on a problem with your highlights blowing out, and you find, okay, that does have, I remember back to that test I made a couple of months ago, and that did have an effect on the highlights. Can I go back to that and apply that to the problem I'm doing right now? So when you start off, you're failing all the time and kind of moving around in the dark, but as you go on, you start to build this base of failures. And so I have an enormous base of failures right now. And so when I find a new problem, I usually know how to fix it on the first go. Sometimes it takes me, 2 things to figure out what's going on, but usually I have that base to go off of. So I recently learned gum printing. I was, because of COVID, I'm not getting workshops. I thought, okay, I'm going to take a shot at gum printing. So what's interesting is, and I kind of knew this going into it, gum printing and carbon printing are pretty much the same process, or at least all the problems that you're going to run into are the exact same. Exactly how you approach those or the materials that you're using are a little bit different, but the base problems are the same. So I can show you, I'm going to flip over to my phone here. So let's turn off this. So I have to mute. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, actually, the phone sound is much better than the computer sound. So maybe even if you switch back to the computer, keep talking to your phone.
Yeah, I can do that. This is my box. Let me flip this around. So here's my box from 3 months of gum printing. I just organized this. So we go from let's see, day 6, spraying test. That's fine. Okay, so gum, day 1. So on my first day, I'm having, absolutely massive failures where I'm not getting really anything to attach. I'm not getting any tone. It's looking just absolutely awful. And so I keep on testing these things. And so by day, what is this? Day 5, I'm getting a pretty good calibration. Everything's sticking to the print. It's looking pretty good. But I kept on going for another couple months, working through all these different failures, knowing that as I'm doing this, I'm building a base that I can, as I'm going through, that I'll be able to learn from and figure out future problems in gum printing. So I'll show you the result of that. So the first gum print I made was this one up here. So here's a black and white one. And then I made a color print. So this was the second print I made. So a little bit better. And then I completely reworked the system and spent about a month and a half. And this was the third print I made. So if you've seen gum prints before, this is not what gum prints look like. So it's kind of cool to go through this process as a novice, starting off in gum printing and seeing how this goes from, learning from my failures at the beginning and kind of going through that whole thing. So.
Do you share what paper you're using for gum?
Gum, the first one I printed was on Arches, and then, or on Fabriano Artistico, and then the second one I printed was on Arches. But I sized the paper, so really you can print on anything. If you treat the paper, you could print on Japanese papers or whatever. So the second thing, I guess, motivation is to look at your perspective. So when I started out printing, one thing you can do is you can look at the whole mountain of work that's ahead of you, or you can kind of think that you're at the top of the mountain and just look at the next step in front of you, knowing that you're going to have to fail 1,000 times before you make a good print, but just the idea of kind of going down a mountain, whereas at the first, you might be on the higher north face and it's all rocky, so you're rappelling down, very risky. Your failures are going to be huge. Your whole print might wash off, things like that. But as you start going down the mountain, you get down to the crevasse, you put on your crampons, and down to the glacier, and maybe you fall into a crevasse at some point. And that might be the equivalent of, maybe the humidity changes in your studio or the season changes. Everything just kind of stops working. You have to figure out, okay, how can I figure this out? How am I going to get out of this rut that I'm in? You climb all that and you keep on going down. You get to the foothills. It's a little bit easier. The problems that you're having are smaller. And, the point I'm right now is basically in the meadow. I've got like maybe a little creek to jump over every once in a while, but the problems I'm facing are very, very small compared to what I had at the beginning. So, taking a workshop speeds up that process. You don't have an Everest to deal with. You might have, a smaller mountain, but you still have a mountain to, climb up or climb down. You still have to put in, your 500 hours afterwards to be able to make a good print. So this was actually how this whole thing got started. When John sent me an email asking, what do you want to talk about? At that moment, I was actually doing consulting for a guy who had come to a workshop last fall, and he really went into carbon printing. He's making excellent color carbon prints already with the negatives that we had from the workshop. Figured everything out, making black and white triple transfers and everything. But then he said, okay, now I'm going to try making my own negatives and making my own prints, try to print with a lot of very, very bright red in it, and just running into just a bunch of different failures. So he was really happy because everything was working. And then all of a sudden everything starts failing. So he's, at the point of tears, or it's just like this hopelessness. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this. So you want to look at this as a process, or you want to look at it as the process. Carbon printing, you could call it failing printing or something or whatever. So when you start off to the process is looking for connections between all these failures as well. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take, all these failures from this box, from each of these days where I may be trying to solve reticulation in gum printing. And so I try solving this through maybe the wavelength that I'm using of my exposure unit, the pigment concentration, the protein content of the gum, the pH, maybe the sizing or adhesiveness of my support, exposure time, thickness of the coating, all these different things. And I'll test these. I'll lay these out on the table, trying to find something that's going to work to fix this. Because after doing all these things, there's certain to be something that fixes it. But in doing so, it might just screw up something else. In workshops, I go through this thing called the balancing act. And I've got about 10 different columns, about 10 different rows with about 4 different columns. And we look at how each of these little things affect something else. So if I increase the amount of pigment, I'm going to reduce the amount of grain, but I'm going or blow down, but I'm also going to increase the amount of staining. And I'm maybe going to get a better black, but my highlights aren't going to be as good. So everything's interconnected. So looking at this kind of interconnectedness of it, it really helps to just lay everything out on the table. And then sometimes I'll just sit there for half an hour or even an hour, just staring at these test charts or whatever I've tested, looking for these connections. And this is like anything else, like playing a music instrument or something, it takes practice. We as humans are very good at seeing patterns, but still it takes practice. So things you can do are to write out, what was your hypothesis, what do you think was going to happen, what did happen, how do you think that could maybe, be related to something else, how can you fix it, or make mind maps, draw out, okay, this is my problem I was trying to fix, how are these, related, how are they interconnected, and try to find those connections. Once you find those connections, then the finding a solution becomes much easier. Because you won't screw something up when you fix that thing. Another thing you can do is just take a break. And I kind of struggle with this because I want to power through everything sometimes. And I get obsessed, and at home, I'm just thinking about printing all the time. Okay, how can I fix this? Why isn't this working? I'm taking a shower, I'm thinking about this. I'm making dinner, I'm thinking about this. I'm going to bed, I'm thinking about this. I come to the studio the next day, I'm just going through a bunch of tests. And so sometimes it's best to just go do something else. And the solution will come to you, whether that's to go climbing or, go out for a walk, or maybe even do a different process or do something else for amount of time. And then all of a sudden, eureka, you'll think, okay, now I know how to fix this problem. You come back and you'll, fix it on the first try. Another thing with failure is just to know when to cut your losses, because not everything is going to work out. With the previous metaphor of falling into a crevasse, recently I had the idea for sensitizing gum prints to use an inkjet printer. And so I bought an inkjet printer, an old 78 or 7900 for $200. Completely stripped the thing and put it back together, and got the nozzles working, and then filled it up with dichromate, and used that to actually print on the paper. It's kind of cool because you don't need a negative, but it's not really that feasible. There's a lot of problems that go with it. There's a possibility of creating an aerosol out of the dichromate. So I kind of decided, okay, that's not something I'm going to pursue. So I just, chalked that up as a failure and, moved on. So there's actually a video I saw, I think it was last week, about extreme ultraviolet lithography. And so making computer chips is actually pretty much the exact same as making carbon print. So if you, I like to have my, holding my phone here. So let's see. There we go.
Except the contrast is a little higher.
Yeah, contrast is a little bit higher. Yeah. So in making a microprocessor, all you're doing is, instead of using paper, you're just using a silicon wafer, which is glass. And then you have a negative in, a mask in making a chip. And you're going to expose through this mask with ultraviolet light, just like we're going to do in carbon printing. And then we're going to build up resistors with whatever the material you're using. And I'm just building up an image with gelatin. So in the end, they're pretty much the exact same. And so I was doing some tests a couple months ago with different wavelengths. So I bought LEDs at 395, 385, 375, 365 nanometers. I bought strips versus point light sources. I also got 275 nanometers. And I wanted to try to get 275 nanometers to work, because the shorter the wavelength, the more precise your print is going to be. These dots are going to have more clarity to them. And that's the same in making microprocessors. The shorter the wavelength, the more transistors you can get in a little space. So they went from, I don't know, it's like 190 something in about 20 years ago down to 170s about 10 years ago. And then they wanted to go down to 150 nanometers, and they just couldn't make it work, and spent hundreds of millions on this. And this company comes along and finally gets extreme ultraviolet lithography to work, which is pretty much using X-rays, because X-rays start at 10 nanometers and this is using 13 nanometers. And so it's just insane. You see the video, and they're to get their light source to work, they've got little molten droplets of tin coming down at 50,000 times a second, and they're exposing with two different lasers, exciting this tin. So it gets excited, and then when the electrons come down, it releases this light at 13 nanometers. So you can make very small transistors. So, they could make 150 nanometers to work, but they scrapped that idea and then finally got 13 nanometers to work. I've been trying to get 275 to work, but it's just, there's so many problems that go with it. The glass absorbs most of the light. Your negative absorbs a lot of it, even the air that it's going through. You run into a lot of problems with bubbles. You can't create a good black. So there's a lot of things that don't make it that feasible. So, it's fine just to, okay, it's not going to work. Move on to something.
Yeah. So going back to the gum print of the flower you posted before, for those of us not really familiar with gum prints, what did you mean by that's not what a gum print looks like?
So my goal with gum printing, and usually a goal with gum printing is kind of more pictorial style, maybe. You're not going for really high precision, and that's usually not the goal for people. And that's, one of the things I love about gum prints. And so I approached it just from a little bit different perspective than what I think gum printers have in the past. And I just wanted to try to make a very precise print.
So it's more about the subject matter.
Yeah, I just want to make a little bit more higher resolution, be able to print colors that are maybe a little bit brighter, a little bit more smoothness to my print, not so much texture from the paper, things like that, which in a lot of cases are the things that make a gum print beautiful. So it's just more of a training exercise than anything else. But the final print actually is, I like it. So it depends on your tastes, really. So
this is what I'm used to seeing as a gum print.
Nice. That actually looks really.
Stephen, say something so it highlights your picture.
Oh, okay. This is what I'm used to seeing as a gum print. This was a photographer by the name of Bonefee, made in about 1895.
Cool. Thank you.
In Syria. I have some old prints here.
So the other thing to keep in mind with failure is, it's okay to fail. It's another cliche, but don't let that suppress your creativity.
Fail forward.
So that print I have of the earth pigments, I never heard of somebody using earth pigments to actually make a full color photograph. I know people have used earth pigments before, but not make a profile and make a full color print like that. I didn't know if it was going to work. I didn't know if the calibration software was going to be able to handle those algorithms of those pigments, because I had to use pigments that are very far away from the normal CMYK. I had to use basically red, green, kind of an oranges, which is kind of yellow, and blue. So it's just completely different from what your normal pigments would be. So I don't know if that would work.
Yeah.
I've got another project coming up, which I think is going to be really cool. And I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to try it anyways. I want to create a photograph so the reason I bought all those different LEDs I was talking about before at different wavelengths, not the UV ones, I bought ones in the visible range too, is to create white light. So it seems like normal white light, 4000K or whatever. And I'll have 2 of those, but just absolutely completely different spectrums. But to our eyes, they'll look the same. And then I want to have a print that's in black and white, but because I've used certain pigments, in one lighting situation, it looks like it's a black and white, but you switch the lighting situation and it looks like it's a color. So just taking the metameric illuminant failure to the max.
That's called metamerism.
Yeah, so I want to take this. I want to
That's
take
right.
this to like a science museum, and so little kids can take this knob and just kind of go between one lighting situation and another, and make a black and white color, black and white color. So I think that'll be really cool.
Cool.
Great
I can
that you
do
want
it.
to
Do you know
great
how
that you
many
want to exploit that.
printer manufacturers
Hang on.
tried their best to get rid of metamerism?
Yeah, but
How
you can do
about-
creative
oh,
things
I
with it.
Yeah. So Stephen, what were you saying?
It's just great that you want to exploit that, because most of us have worked very hard to solve it as a problem.
Yeah,
And then
and
bringing
then
it right back
yeah.
around is very cool.
Yeah.
So Calvin,
Years ago, when I worked for Macbeth, they had a project with AT&T. AT&T at one time had these dark green trucks all over the country, and people kept running into them because they were next to the hedges, then people didn't see them. So they wanted tricolor trucks, but they wanted the trucks to look the same no matter what light source they were sitting under. And that was actually a very expensive project that Macbeth did, trying to find the right pigments and the right colors to paint the trucks.
so Calvin, you mentioned calibration there. Maybe you should mention your book again and give a link to your website in the chat.
Yeah, I'll when I switch back to my computer, I'll show some of my
Okay.
on-screen stuff. So I kind of skipped over how to make negatives and things like that when I looked at the process. So I can show a little bit of
Great.
calibration there as well.
And Stephen also asked here, you mentioned profiles. Are you printing test targets and creating your CMYK separation profiles?
I haven't printed a normal CMYK print in a long time. I go beyond that. So I'm incorporating other colors to reduce the amount of metamerism. So I'm using iron oxide for portraits, so that the color that your skin tone isn't going to change depending on the age you are or what you're looking, the luminate you're looking on, or things like that. So I mostly print multi-channel profiles. So next, so don't let the sense of hopelessness overwhelm you. So after a couple of months of working on a problem, failing over and over again, it can seem kind of helpless. But some things you can do are to look at your progress so far. So compared to the previous prints. So remember at the beginning, you had a bunch of problems with maybe bubbles, but now you saw that your prints don't have bubbles. You've made that progress. So you can kind of remind yourself, okay, I am advancing. It doesn't seem like it now, but I'm making some progress. Seek help. There are forums, there are teachers, specialists, there are, talks like this where you can ask me questions. Try something easier. So if you're working on making color carbon prints, triple transfers with extra gloss layers, it's not working. What you can do is just, go, try a black and white print, a single transfer, try something easier. Look for motivation in other people, printers you admire, or maybe in photographers like you guys, look at your profiles and, okay, find people, photographers whose prints I want to print at some point, and think, okay, that's my goal, to be able to, get to that level where I'd, be able to make a print for that person or something. And that kind of brings me to my next point. Don't compare your prints with others. So for many reasons, not necessarily from an artistic or creative perspective, but it can give you unrealistic expectations. So your prints might then seem as failures, but you should see them as successes given the amount of time that you've put into making that print. So if you compare if you're, just a weekend warrior, just making prints on the weekend, and you compare your prints to mine, this is what I do. I don't do anything else. I'm just a printer. So if you compare your prints to mine, expecting them to look the same, they're not. If you're a computer programmer and I just picked up programming on the weekends, I'm not going to program as good as you ever. So just to keep that in mind. So moving on. How can we deal with anxiety, stress, and depression? So this is kind of more of a large scale thing, kind of making a living and doing this. But, if I'm working on print, I need that print to work to be able to pay rent, or maybe, the grocery shop that week or whatever. And if it doesn't work out, then I'm putting a lot of pressure on that print. So when I get to and this still happens too, like I get to the end, I've been working on print for a week or maybe a month or maybe even longer. And I come to the very last step, and I just have to peel this paper apart. My heart is, it's really stressful. And if it works out, a lot of times I just go home and take a nap because I'm just so much stress. And if it doesn't work out, then I'm just depressed because it's like, oh God, this sucks. But when it does work out, the feeling of achievement is just so much better. And that's what it comes down to a lot of times. I guess if it worked on the first try, we'd just all make inkjet prints, or at least I would. If it's the amount of effort that goes into this that really gives it value, because there are very few people that are making these, and the people who are making them are only going to make a few of them because they take so long to make. And so when I finish a project like that one of the earth pigments, just sat there. I just sat there for probably about an hour or 2 hours and just stared at the thing. That was the most beautiful thing ever. So when it works out in the end, it's just worth it, all that failure.
So I got a question coming in about shrinkage.
Yeah.
I've seen carbon prints from the 30s and many with cracked surfaces. I was told it's a long-term problem with shrink differential of the different pigments.
Yeah, so I've got a couple theories on this. There's a couple of things that can be happening. The main theory behind why this happens is just the emulsion's too thick. So when the gelatin on there, if you use very little pigment, you have to make a very thick layer. And so over time, is that, grabs humidity, gets dry, it's going to crack over time, just like an oil painting. So that's why you have to print over something that is either less flexible than what you're putting on top, so thick or thin. Or the other theory that I have is just the substrate that you're printing on is not appropriate for what you're printing on. The adhesion isn't good enough. So a lot of times glossy surfaces, the adhesion isn't that good. So over time, it's going to crack. This is something that's kind of hard to test. I'm working on an experiment. I have she should have been here in January, but because of COVID, she didn't come. But somebody who's working on their master's for printing. So she's going to come for 6 months, and one of the things I'm going to have her do is set up that test. And I'm going to make a number of different emulsions and prints with different characteristics, and then put them out in the sun and see what happens, in 5-10 years. See if I can get some of them to crack and some not.
Cool. So Michael is asking, what about the same image printed on an Epson printer and a carbon print? How do they compare to each other?
So the Epson print, the first thing you're going to notice is the depth of the image. So what's kind of cool about carbon printing, so I imagine if I print just a pure black surface, and then I could print a full tonal scale on top of that. You won't see anything in normal lighting, but take it out in the sun and you'll all of a sudden see all this depth in the shadows. So that's kind of the first thing you're going to see. The other thing you're going to see is, let's see if I can flip my camera around and actually have, where did I put it? Here we go. This is how I make guacamole. So no Photoshop involved, but let's see with the loop. So can we see the little dots? I don't know if we're gonna have the resolution here. But
in the hair?
Yeah, no, you see all the dots for the inkjet printer. They're huge.
Okay.
Whereas in the carbon print, there are no dots. The resolution is much, much greater. And I kind of made there's a, come over here, my computer. Let me pull this up really quickly. John Cohen made a kind of example print with 1-point font a while back with his inks and using Pigments inks versus kind of a normal inkjet printer. So I kind of sort of in response to that, I did my little thing of comparing a carbon print with an inkjet printer made with image setter negatives. So if I made a carbon print with inkjet negatives, you know, I can't make a print that's better than something that I'm using to make it. So there's no way I can make a print that's better than an inkjet print if I use an inkjet printer. And my goal has always been to make something that's better. So that's why I use the image setter negatives. The resolution is just much, much higher.
So what is the resolution of image setters these days? Back in the 80s when I was using them, they were 1200 and 2400.
Yeah, it's about the same.
Okay.
But don't let that, you know, you see inkjet printers can print at 2880 DPI and things like that. One thing is resolution. Another thing is addressability of those dots. So the dots are just kind of randomly placed on the page. So the resolution is just really, really low actually in inkjet prints compared to if you could place those dots correctly, the resolution would be insane, but you can't. So
No, why not?
why can't you place those accurately?
Yeah.
It's far away from the paper. You've got this, you're spraying these dots.
Okay.
You're never gonna, it's like if you're throwing a water balloon or something compared to using a laser, which is how the image setter negatives are exposed with a laser.
So no, look, if they were to get the ink heads closer to the paper, the resolution on the paper would be better?
Yeah,
Sort of like
it might
contact
help.
printing.
It might help a little bit, but it's still not going to be there because your dot size is also huge. There are 30, 40 microns, whereas an image setter is, if you're working with large stuff, 20 microns, but you can go down to 10, even 5 microns with the DITR film, or even more. So you can, it's kind of like within a single, I don't know why I'm not finding this. I'm trying to find it on my Instagram here. Here we go. So here's the inkjet on the top. Here's the carbon print on the bottom, and this is a pencil lead. so it's way, way, way higher resolution. It's not even close. So those dots are also just much larger than what I'm using. So within a single dot, I can fit 4 or 5 of my dots, so I can get much more gradients. So it's as if, because I'm using for my prints usually 10 different negatives, and if each of those negatives is the equivalent of 3 or 4 different inks in your inkjet printer, it's like having an inkjet printer with 30 or 40 different inks and a dot size much smaller and much, much, much more precision than you would get from inkjet printers.
This may be an obvious question, but how do you register the 10?
So I've got a light table, basically. Well, it's my vacuum frame, actually. So here's my vacuum frame with the prints on it. I've got a strip that has these little
Pin registers.
Yeah, pins here. And then I visually line them up with registration marks that I have on the glass. I find this much better than using a light table and then punching everything. You just have to make sure that the temperature is the same throughout the day, because the expansion coefficient of the glass is different from the negatives. So we're talking about differences of a few microns. So sure. I can get registration within less than the width of your hair. So it's precise.
Stephen Shore is on overdrive again.
Well, Stevens, who introduced me to Calvin.
Oh, doesn't matter. He's still on overdrive.
So let me ask a question.
Always when it comes to science.
Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, if in carbon printing, each print is so labor intensive and unique, I would assume that if you're making more than one of the same image, that they're each going to be unique in some way and not necessarily an exact duplicate.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I've got everything controlled to about 2% variance between prints, so they're pretty close in color. At least registration might be a little bit different between the two. One might have some defects in some little spot, but they'll be pretty close to each other. So if they're not side by side, you're not going to notice much of a difference between them, just because I have everything really controlled. If I wanted to add a little bit more, variety in my prints, yeah, I could, start, not controlling exposure times as much and things like that to add a little bit more variety, but I've got everything pretty well controlled, so I can get pretty consistent prints.
So would that be the case if you were doing, let's say, a series of 4 images from the same, from a shoot, for example?
Yeah, no, that you'd be able to match that style perfectly. We're talking, the difference that unless you have them side by side, there's no way that you're going to see a difference between the 2 prints. So because 2 prints are never displayed the same, like it's going to show up what you have on the screen, basically. So
Prints that are made in the darkroom have the same variance. Wet printing.
yeah.
That's the same variance in regular darkroom.
Yeah,
Wet
it's
processing.
very minimal. It's very minimal. It's not something you're going to really notice.
Unless you're doing a lot of dodging and burning and get the stance down to just where you're going to do
Well,
things.
but by that,
No, when I'm
by
working
that-
with analog negatives, it's very different.
by that time, what you're doing is you're actually also, in the old days, you're making a master negative from your final print, and then using the master negative to make
Okay.
everything else in wet printing. Right?
Cool.
Yeah.
We have other questions coming in.
Yeah, I can also share my screen here and I can show some of the digital side of this as well. If
Sure.
you want to see that. So
Calvin,
I need to
Calvin,
leave. Yeah,
Where were you originally from?
Minnesota.
Didn't the accent give it away?
I thought he was from New Jersey.
No, I'm from Jersey.
You're not from Jersey. You're from Hoboken.
I was born in Brooklyn. You want to
Oh,
make something
okay.
of it?
All right. So can you see my screen here?
Yep.
All right. So let's say somebody sends me this photo. I'll add margins and registration marks and all that stuff to this, but we're just going to skip over that right now. And so I'll come here to edit, convert to profile, and I have all these profiles that I've built. So if I'm using just earth pigments, I can get an idea of kind of what this is going to look like. I'm not going to get these deep reds and stuff if I'm just using earth pigments to create this print. But I'm using dirt, so you can't expect the gamut to be that large. My standard profile is this one here. And here I can easily print these colors, even though this is kind of a reduced gamut as well. But I find that that's what's best for most photos. So once I click OK, you're going to see these channels over here go from RGB to CMYK plus in iron oxide. So this one here is actually iron oxide. And this one over here is my normal yellow. And you see the colors just completely change, but that's just because Photoshop isn't able to display multi-channel profiles without a plugin. So then I'm going to come over here to split channels, and then I'm getting basically just a black and white photo for each of these colors. So I've got for cyan is just a black and white photo. Before I invert this and create my negative, I need to apply some curves. So I'm going to apply, so load curves preset. And I have all these curves here. This is for my Earth CMYKs. So I've got linearizations and separations. So I'm separating this into lights and darks for most of these colors. So this is cyan. So I'm going to grab my light cyan here. So this is going to separate out all the light cyan. This is kind of the exact same as your inkjet printer has a light cyan and a dark cyan. So after I've applied this, I need to add a linearization curve to this because it's not going to come out looking exactly like I have on the screen here. There's a little bit of dot gain in here. So I'm going to add linearization, earth, cyan, light. And that's just going to lighten up my photo a little bit. So now when I merge these all together, invert it, this is what I'll actually use to print with. So all I need to do is expose this for a certain amount of time, given my exposure times that I've calculated over here. So I have goal values. So these are lab values. It just says, okay, what color am I going for? So I just have to figure out how long do I need to expose this to get this color? And then I just expose it, okay, for 29 units. And that will be my light cyan negative. And then I just go over to my dark cyan and then, repeat this process about 10 times and, you got to print. Easy peasy.
What is the size limit of the carbon prints, or is there?
So the largest I print is about 60 by 80 centimeters, which is about 24 by 30 inches. I can print larger, but I have to set up the studio. I have to make a new coding table, change some of the registration stuff to be able to print that large. But it is doable up to about 85 by 100 centimeters, about 32 by maybe 40, not even, about 40 inches, 38 inches, something like that. So
cool.
Not big. And you notice a lot of my prints around the studio, they're not big prints. I'm not a huge fan of making big prints. That's not the goal.
I mean, there's something nice about smaller prints too.
Yeah.
It's a little more intimate.
Yeah.
You can hold it and really get
it's
into
kind
it.
of contradictory to what's happening in galleries right now, where everybody wants bigger and bigger prints. But not everybody has huge walls to put prints on. Some people have small walls, so small prints are good.
Michael, you're muted. It looks.
That's what Da Vinci said with the Mona Lisa too. You know how big the Mona Lisa is?
Yeah, not that big.
Very small.
Yeah. Anya is asking, what about gum print size limit? Is there similar?
Gum print is actually easier to do much larger, especially with the method I developed, where I'm actually printing or applying the gum with a HVLP sprayer. So there's no size limit. You can make huge prints. You just need a sink large enough to develop it in, really, and sensitize it in too. Because I'm not spraying dichromate. Don't spray dichromate. That's a bad idea. So I mean, using an HVLP sprayer to apply gum has been done in the past, but they put the dichromate in with it, which is just it's just crazy. So I figured out a method where you could sensitize it afterwards.
So we're talking about dichromate and about UV lights. Do we have to put a signed warning on here? Don't do this at home.
Don't do this at home. That gum print that I made is the last gum print I'll ever make, just because it's used dichromate. I don't like dichromate. It's not something I want to do. I use for carbon printing, a organic compound that's supposedly much less toxic.
Cool.
Hey, John, I have a question for you. John.
Okay.
There was a printing process before inkjet printers, but it used some sort of a spray.
The crayon spitting pigs?
No. It was a printing process. I know.
Iris prints?
Iris prints.
Iris, yeah.
Yes, Iris.
They're pretty much just inkjet prints, just old-fashioned inkjet prints.
But so is carbon. But how does the Iris print compare to the carbon print?
Well, it'd be the same kind of thing, difference between an inkjet and a carbon print. And I'm pretty sure the resolution too on an Iris is probably much less than you
Yeah, maybe Stephen Johnson or Jeff can talk about that.
The Iris is much lower resolution than a typical inkjet.
Say that again, Stephen.
The Iris was much lower resolution than a typical inkjet.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And just two more questions. Promise. All right?
Promise.
Not related to anything we've been talking about. How do you go from Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Spain?
Oh, that's easy.
You got married.
Yep, that's it.
That's what I thought. Okay. Okay, okay. Then the other thing is,
No, I originally came here because, as I mentioned, my training is in music, and the town where I live in is extremely musical. Out of the 20,000 people that live in this town, we have 2 bands of about 500 members each.
where, in Spain? In Spain?
Yeah. So I came here for music at first, and met my wife, and then afterwards started carbon printing. So,
Now, the image that you showed earlier on the wall of 2 women in bathing suits on the beach
Yeah.
with umbrellas.
Yeah.
Is that your image, or is that
No, that's,
what I thought was Robert Farber?
No, Louise Dahlwolf. So that was shot for Vogue in 1954, something like that. So I contacted what's the parent company of Vogue? I can't remember right now.
Condé Nast?
Yeah.
No, something else.
But anyway, their parent, yeah.
Yeah, whoever had the rights to it. And so I just got the rights to be able to make a print for myself, which is like $500 and I can't sell the thing. But I you know, so I like the image though. I wanted to use it. So
Cool. Well, we're an hour and a half in. I don't know how much more you want to cover or what your time limit is. We can keep going or we can wind it down.
yeah, I'm fine answering a few more questions, but
Yeah.
I do have.
Let's open it up to the audience. You can unmute and ask some questions.
John, how many colors are in a typical print that you make, Calvin?
How many colors?
Yeah, how many colors do you normally use?
Yeah, so I've got those different separations like light cyan, cyan. Those are all exposed onto one color. They're exposed both on the same emulsion. So I have usually cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and then the iron oxide. If there's a color that I can't produce within that gamut, like there's a Ferrari in the photo, well, I'll grab a red, or I'll grab a green or an orange or a violet. To expand that gamut to get that color. But normally I don't have to do that.
Essentially like a spot color addition to the separation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Calvin. Hi, Calvin from Vienna.
Hey.
Hello, welcome.
Quick question. Why nobody is using laser printer to produce negatives?
Resolution and size. So if you're just making small prints and maybe making gum prints, they can't really produce that high resolution. Laser printers might actually work pretty well, but they don't make 30-inch wide laser printers that I know of. And basically, what I'm using is a laser printer. Well, technology is quite a bit different, but I'm using a laser to expose the image setter film. So in a sense, it is a laser that's printing. So that's what I use, the image setter.
Yeah, we're also trying to use image setter negatives, but unfortunately, we don't have access to this second order raster.
Yeah,
we just have normal one. So is it good enough, or it's still better to switch to?
Yeah. So if you're just printing, one negative, it actually works pretty well. It's when you have to print 2 layers and have to angle it, you get that rosette in there. That's where you start to really notice the screen. You can print at 200 lines per inch, and it's not terribly noticeable, but I find it a little bit noticeable. But if you're trying to print highlights and stuff, it's still going to work better than an inkjet printer. It's at some point, I don't know if I'll start outsourcing negatives, but it is one of the trickier things for people who take the workshop, go back, is to find somebody who makes negatives. And the things you want to look for when searching for negatives are places that do flexography. Look for keywords in Google search as Kodak, DITR, and Flexel. And those will usually kind of bring you towards what you're looking for. Another company is Miraklon. They source a lot of this material. And to give you an example of how prevalent this is, just in Valencia, there's 5 different places that can do this. Within Spain, there's like, I don't know, 20 or 30. So they're there. You just have to search for them. The problem is finding places that do FM screening. because most places just do AM.
Yeah.
One client, what he figured out was to have one place do the screening for him. So he pays them 20 euros for a full sheet to do the screening. And then they just send him a 1-bit TIFF, which he can send to the person who does the actual filming of the screen. So you can split into 2 steps, but yeah, it is hard to find somebody who can do an FM screen.
So Stephen Johnson was asking, is there a halftone screen used with the image setter for your negatives?
Yeah, I mean, it's a halftone. That's what so you just have completely transparent and black with a density of about 4. So there's no light coming through there. So that screen, whether you're using a traditional AM screen, like you'd see in a textbook or whatever, or using an FM screen, which would be closer to what you see in an inkjet printer, or a hybrid screen, which is what I use. You know, they're all halftone.
Great. Anyone else? You got your chance now.
I have a quick question earlier
Jen.
when you were talking about viewing in multi-channel, that there was a Photoshop plugin needed for that. Do you know what it is off the top of your head?
There's a few of them. I think I haven't purchased any of these, but I think the most common is called GMC.
Thank you.
GMC calling. And I believe they can, there's some other companies too out there, but I haven't downloaded it because I don't know. They tend to be kind of expensive. A lot of these softwares tend to be really expensive because they're for, you know, printing houses that have a lot of output. So just like that screen from Kodak, you know, it's 20 grand. Or the GMC, I think it's like over 1,000. So they tend to be quite pricey.
When you gonna open a border, Calvin?
I'll
I'm
open it as
tired
soon
of
as I
waiting.
Yeah, we're all waiting. Well, thank you, Calvin. This has been great.
Yeah. So I'm gonna
That's very-
actually go finish up some emulsions that I've been working on today.
Yeah, do you want to throw in the link into the chat so people will know where to find you and your book?
Yeah. Let's see.
So it's 300 pages on calibration.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Good book. So www.webprint.com. And I plan on doing some other books too at some point, maybe learning, and that's kind of why I learned gum printing, is to at some point write a book on that. Maybe we do one on screen printing, Photographic Emulsion, and kind of learn the pigment-based processes.
Yeah, while you're getting that, Jan posted in another question. He works in humidity around 40 to 50%. What must he think about when he starts to make gelatin matrix for a carbon print?
If it drops too low, it's an issue because it can peel off. There's too much tension. So if it drops below, 20 or something, it's gonna be risky, especially if it's thick, depending on how thick your matrix is, how much pigment you added. But also if it's too high, it's just gonna take too long to dry. So yeah, 40-50% humidity is nice. So I just threw the link in the chat. So
Yeah, and Jeff is asking about photos on your website. You want to clarify that, Jeff?
Yeah, where are they? When I click on
it's the gallery. So the second one over, so you have about, then the second one's gallery.
Is it not working maybe?
It worked for me.
Oh, okay.
It should have about, gallery, services, workshops, store up there. But those are, I haven't updated that in about 3 years. So those like the first prints I made.
Yeah, when
My
I
more
click
recent stuff,
on your
you can see
home-
my recent work on Instagram. So I'll post that. I'll post my
Okay.
Instagram account here.
It's also under store prints.
There we go. So there's my Instagram. You can check out there. The more recent stuff I'm doing.
Great.
I should update my website at some point, but there's just so much to do.
Very cool. Well, thank you again. I'm going to stop the Facebook feed. And okay, we're still live here. So everyone to send your thanks.
Oh, truly, absolutely incredible work. I had no idea that anything like this actually existed. I thought carbon printing was when I used my pencil.
That's a good one.
Very cool. Well, thank you all.